noticed that eldest daughters do a lot of labor, but they don't have a lot of power. Resentment is the biggest sign of a boundary transgression. And when we jump to fix other people's problems, we are actually disrespecting our own boundary. The way our parents raised us is our inheritance, but it is not our future. And so we must do the work of decoupling all of the stuff that our parents have given us that is not helpful for us.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Yellow Chair Collective podcast. We are your hosts, Linda Yoon and Soo Jin Lee, therapists and oldest daughters of Korean immigrant families. We are here today with Israa Nassir, therapist, speaker, founder of Well Guide, and author of recently published book, Toxic Productivity. He is oldest daughter herself. Welcome to the Yellow Chair podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited for this conversation about eldest daughters and how it shows up in so many different ways of our life.
Absolutely. I think what you're going to be speaking on is going to land very well with us as eldest daughters today. To just get us started, would you tell us a little bit about your actual family background and what it was like growing up as an eldest daughter yourself too?
So I'm Pakistani by background. I grew up in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and then we moved to Toronto when I was 13, and then I moved to New York later on in my late 20s. So I've moved around a lot. I am the middle child, eldest daughter. So I have an older brother, and I think for a variety of reasons, some of the eldest daughter stuff kicked in for me much later in life, like in my mid-20s onwards. Some of the parentification stuff did kick in earlier when I was younger. I think being a middle child does intersect with some of this when it comes to gender and culture, which we can get into later.
Yeah.
My experience of being the eldest daughter is not the most quintessential one, which is why I think it's important for us to talk about all of the different ways it can show up. And sometimes you don't even have to be the eldest daughter to experience that pressure in a family. For example, I am not a type A personality, the planner. I am the girl who shows up. My phone will always be charged, but I just show up. My sister, who's younger than me, is the planner. She's the type A. But in so many ways, she is the youngest. And in so many ways, when it comes to emotional caretaking, I do fit in the bill. So I think it's good for us to kind of talk about the diversity of what it looks like.
Absolutely. We wanted to kind of dive into that specific topic of toxic productivity, especially, it's the title of your book. We wanted to get a little bit of introduction of that. And as we discussed, there's cross-sectionality for the identity of eldest daughters. Would you tell us, first of all, what is toxic productivity?
Yeah, so toxic productivity is essentially when we become hyperfixated on outcome and achievement in our life, and whether or not we actually achieve the things we're planning for becomes completely connected to how good we feel about ourselves. So our self-worth becomes dependent on whether or not we can have these achievements, whether or not we can do these outcomes. And so our life becomes very checklist oriented. So you kind of have to do a lot of things to feel good about yourself. The pursuit of achievement, productivity, being busy, essentially makes you feel more valued, more needed, and you create these dependencies in your life where people now depend on you to do these things because you've been doing them. And you kind of deprioritize your wellness, your relationships, the things that bring you joy because you're always trying to achieve something. And I think historically, we've always believed that this is something that affects people in the workplace. But newer research is showing that, we kind of bring the same mindset to our relationships, to our personal development, to our nutrition, our bodies. We're always trying to achieve and optimize and make the most out of our vacation or make the most of, And some of the drivers of toxic productivity are very much intersecting with the eldest daughter. So really high expectations, very rigid expectations, perfectionism, shame and guilt, and a very loud inner critic. These are all things that I think a lot of eldest daughters can identify with, but they're also things that happen in toxic productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Even just when you mentioned about, the nutrition, right? How rigid it is to be able to follow a routine. Even though the goal is to be healthy, it almost seems like it's burdensome to be healthy all of a sudden, right?
Yeah.
And vacationing too, like you mentioned, yeah, even vacationing, like if, I know plenty of people that love planning their each hour of their vacation. They know exactly what they're going to be doing. They're packing it with these activities, right? It's like, what's the purpose of that vacation to begin with? It loses kind of that value.
Exactly.
And I know you touched on this a little bit, but do you think oldest daughters are more prone to toxic productivity?
I would say yes, not based on any scientific data, but just anecdotally. I have a lot of clients who are eldest daughters as well, and they happen to be Asian. I think because from a very young age, eldest daughters are valued at how good they can be. Can you be the good older sister who cares for the younger siblings? Can you be the good older sister who's like mommy and daddy's helper? So a lot of like our original self-concept of how much people value us becomes connected with our output. What can I give you? How can I give you something in return for you to love me? So we definitely learned that our achievement can be bartered for acceptance. And then that just lays the foundation for toxic productivity. And then we bring this into our workplaces without even knowing it. We bring this into academics. We bring it into our romantic relationships. And a lot of us, if you look at the comment section of any eldest daughter post, most of us are really burnt out.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you mentioned in relationships, right? Like, this is how I'm trying to show you that I love you. And there is like an actionable thing that you have to do. And that's how we were taught. I feel like this has a little bit of that cultural element as well. I know we all identify with growing up in an immigrant family household. And so I wonder how much of that plays into it too.
I would say that even if you remove like the eldest daughter portion, the realities of being an immigrant require you to be very productive in order to survive. Like, our parents didn't come here to thrive. They were, their task was survival. And so there's a whole idea of like self-care or joy or rest. Like those things were not often available to many immigrant parent generation folks, right? And they didn't have any other choice besides doing all of these things. And like I can speak about my parents, they were expats in the Middle East, immigrants in Canada. Like, you're starting over constantly. You're having to prove yourself to the local population. Like, it requires a lot. Many immigrants, especially from the Asian diaspora, were fleeing violence, fleeing poverty. That's not every person, but a lot of people were. So you're already coming in with this survival trauma, right?
Right.
Being a child of immigrants in and of itself, it's very easy to fall into the trap of, I need to do more to prove myself. Because sometimes that's the language our parents are speaking. Sometimes that's the reality that we see. And then we grow older and we enter the workforce and we're kind of hit with the model minority myth. We're slapped with the bamboo ceiling, right? Like we're constantly fighting these systemic things that are also telling us that if you work hard enough, you will break through, which is a lie. Like we know this, right? Meritocracy is a lie. And so I think together those two things can really settle in. And then of course you add the gender element of females being thought to be more nurturing or more caretaking or naturally having a maternal instinct, right? Like all of these stereotypes come together where it's very difficult to separate your sense of self from what you can give to other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We really resonate, being oldest daughters and immigrant ourselves, coming from immigrant family ourselves. And I would like to learn a little bit more about that gender, right? You're not the oldest child. You had an older brother. However, you were the oldest daughter. and you have to take on that what is typically expected on the oldest child because you're a daughter, right? Would you share more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can share the more the more typical experience. So I will say that my experience was not as typical because my brother definitely got a lot of the oldest child pressure. Like he is the one who was making the food and the lunches. Like he is the one who was making the bottles for my younger sister. Like I was not doing that. I think that in my family, and this is just and there's many families like this, my parents did have the same expectation irrespective of gender. So I think that's why, and the way he internalized that pressure and what it led to in his life is very different in the way he internalizes responsibility and the way I internalize it. I think that as a child, I didn't really feel it that much. As a child, I think he definitely bore the bigger brunt of it. I think for me, the expectation was around being the good girl. So it was less about what I'm bringing. It's more about being small. Like, I'm not the one who had a lot of big emotions. I was not really allowed anger. My brother had anger. My sister had anger. I was not allowed a lot of anger. I was the easygoing child. The easygoing child is the parentified child, right? And so I was very self-sufficient. So I think in that way, it did come as the eldest daughter, where you realize that you have to take care of your own emotions. So the emotional caretaking piece was very typical for me. Very early on, I became self-sufficient, did my own work, did my own homework, figured out my friend problems myself, right? Like I wasn't seeking, because I just knew it was not going to be available, right? Because like my parents were busy with my other two siblings. In Eastern, like Asian, Middle East, North Africa, those communities that are somewhat patriarchal still, it will bypass the oldest son. The household domestic chores will bypass the older son.
Yep.
And he might become responsible for more of the gendered male responsibilities. So what I notice a lot, and I'll speak just of the Asian diaspora because we're all Asian here, older brothers, when they're the oldest sibling, become gatekeepers of permission. So a lot of times parents will default to them to be like, oh, should the younger daughter go to the dance? They kind of become these gatekeepers because the immigrant parents are relying on the brother to protect the girls. That's like the dynamic, that often happens typically. And the maternal, quote, domestic, quote, responsibilities then fall on the daughter, even if she's second in line.
Right.
So now she's the one whose lunches, homework, clothes, like ironing clothes or all of those things. That does happen, even if there is an older brother present. And in a lot of patriarchal families, she also becomes subservient to the older brother. I have seen that happen, even in my extended family, is that you serve your older brother, you warm up food for him, you do all of these things. And he kind of becomes like a mini father figure. So I noticed that eldest daughters do a lot of labor, but they don't have a lot of power.
Yeah, I definitely know my own friends, Asian friends or clients who are not the oldest child, but who are the oldest daughter, end up becoming responsible for a lot of emotional and domestic caretaker, but they do not have power because it goes to the oldest son. And even when they're oldest daughter, I have seen that happening too. The preference to the son, the brother, even they're younger, sometimes that becomes that power dynamic as well, which has been interesting.
Yeah.
That gender role that we're talking about, it's so tangible for me as I'm listening to all of this and reflecting on my own family. Because in my family, in Korean households, in the funerals, the stoneheads will have all of the sons, the first sons, their names on it. None of the daughters do. But the chores of serving these ancestors, who are the ones that are supposed to cook the meals for the ancestral, ceremonies, who are the ones, carving the fruits out for them, that all goes to the women, the daughters of the households.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so
Interesting.
there's a clear invisibility that happens even though you're in servitude of the sons in the
Yeah.
family.
Yeah. And I feel like, for a certain type of person, that can create a lot of cognitive dissonance when you're younger. Like if you are a little bit more thoughtful just by temperament as a child, right? Like some children are very, like they're not very observant.
Yeah.
Some kids are more observant and they know how to connect the dots just temperamentally.
Yeah.
It's like if you are that type of child, then it can create a lot of cognitive dissonance because you're watching this happen. You're like, oh, as a girl, you're like, oh, I just have to live in servitude. And even though you might have aspirations otherwise, some of the things that I see as it translates into decisions you actually end up making in your relationships reflect that foundational learning. I often see that if you're somebody who absorbed it very early on, it just shows up as your blueprint for a relationship, even though you intellectually know otherwise.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then we hear a lot of women who are very high achieving, right, in their career paths, but they're willing to give up if there is an advancement opportunity for their spouses, right? It's just a given that they would be the ones that would be giving up their career, their livelihood, their dreams, right, for the sake of the family.
Yes. Or they continue the subservience in domestic labor, even if both partners work equal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Who is doing the dishes tonight?
It's a really interesting thing to negotiate because, especially if you marry an Asian man, because he's coming in with his foundational learning, right? So even if he also intellectually knows this and he's like, I'm a feminist ally, and you are like, I'm a feminist too, and we're not gonna, recreate the cycle, you inevitably fall into it because it's your default setting. Unless you don't talk about it and you both have to be on the same page and you both have to negotiate it because he's got a lifetime of being told certain things.
Right.
And you've got a lifetime of being told certain things.
Yeah. So I feel like we're starting to talk about some like boundary settings here, right? This narrative is just innately in us. We're choosing to serve. We're having a really hard time choosing to do other things otherwise. So how do we begin to find some sense of balance or some sense of boundary setting here?
Gosh, this is a big question. And I think that it can be tackled in so many ways. And I'd love to hear your perspectives on it too. But I think the first thing, and I'm speaking both from my own experiences, but also as a therapist, right? Because this is also my lived experience. I think the first thing is actually recognizing where your boundary is. I think most of us don't even know where our boundary is because it's so confused with what is expected of us. Many of us, especially like children of immigrants, have a delayed, what is the word? Individuation, right? So if you think that there is a Western map of identity development, what the Western framework says you achieve in your early 20s, now we're seeing en masse that the Asian diaspora kids achieve it in their late 20s. They call it like a delayed identity individuation, but I think that's just the pace of our culture. But I think because of that, we don't actually know a lot of our boundaries because we are coming into our own around the same time we start to get married. Your late 20s or early 30s. That's when we're really individuating from our families. Right. We're learning what our values are and all that stuff, right? I think the first step is to really recognize what your boundary is, which pieces are learned for you that you want to keep and which you don't want to keep. I think that's also really important. We don't have to reject everything outright, and a good example of this I'll share is I meet a lot of South Asian women who very aggressively say that they hate cooking and they don't know how to cook and they'll never learn how to cook. And these are women in their late 20s, early 30s, late 30s like me. There's this defiance of like, I'm not going to cook. Like, I'm just not going to do it. I don't do it. I'll never date a guy who doesn't cook. Like, there's this almost like rebellion. And what are they rebelling against? Their family system. They saw their mothers slave away, holidays, summer break, evenings. They saw their moms at the kitchen and they saw how miserable their moms were. And so what does that do? You say, I'm never going to let that happen to myself. So now you've created this boundary. Now you're dating and you're weeding out the guys who don't know how to cook. You're so singularly focused on this. But cooking is a life skill. Cooking is something everybody should know. You don't have to love it. Not everybody has to be Julia Child and Martha Stewart. But what I often do with my Asian clients is let's really think about where this value and this boundary is coming from. Is this a reaction to something from your childhood, or is it something that you are truly empowered in right now? And I think that is the beginning of that exploration. It's really important to know where your real boundaries are.
I love how you're mentioning about value setting, because oftentimes I feel like it's not something that is often discussed when we're talking about boundaries. It feels like a physical thing that we have to do, like this bubble that we're trying to shield ourselves with. But in fact, if we're talking about values, then it's more inviting to set the boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And so it feels connective, it feels more relational versus like, okay, I'm about to disconnect from you, which boundary often very much feels like.
Yeah, and I would say that, I think that's the common misconception in pop psych right now. People are very confused about the difference between an ultimatum and a boundary, right? People think a boundary is an ultimatum. And when I often say, boundaries are windows, they are not doors, they're windows. You're supposed to keep the connection going. Boundaries are supposed to be conversations. At some point, when someone is consistently disrespecting your boundary, you have to close the door, right? Like, of course, we all know this. But that's not the first step in a boundary. The first step in a boundary is saying, how can we meet in the middle so I'm safe and you're safe? Like, that's the conversation. And so when it comes to this type of like understanding the eldest daughter trauma, small t trauma, I'll say for the purpose of this conversation, there's like an emotional scarring there, right? We are scarred by some of our experiences. Whether we know them or not, they define who we are and they define what we demand in a relationship. They define how we feel safe. And so the first thing is like this awareness of like, what is my trigger point? Where do I bristle? Why do I like this? Why do I not like this? All of those things, right? And then you want to invite your partner, your friend, or your younger sibling into the conversation. You want to say, hey, like, I notice I do this all the time. Do you notice that? So one of the things that I was very guilty of doing is jumping in to solve my sister's problems. She would just say the problem and I'd be like, here's what you should do, right? And I mean, she appreciated and enjoyed that for a very long time because obviously, why wouldn't she? Yeah. But then like somewhere when she hit her 30s, then we started kind of having these like disagreements about this stuff, right? And that made me realize that I'm jumping in to solve her problems. And what's happened is here's this 31-year-old girl who has no experience in solving her own problems. Because I did not allow that. Like I took away that opportunity for her, actually, right? Like I completely enabled this codependency on me. And then I was mad about the fact that she couldn't solve her own problems. And so it required me to be like, hey, like when you tell me stuff, do you notice that I immediately try to tell you what to do? And so it started this conversation, and then you go into the boundary where it's like, okay, the next time you come to me with a problem, I'm actually not going to tell you a solution. I'm only going to listen to you until you tell me 3 solutions yourself. So you create this system for success, and it might be easier to do with a sibling than a romantic partner.
I'm just going to say that dynamic is translating exactly into the romantic partnerships, right?
Yeah, that story. I mean, I have a younger sister. I'm the oldest daughter. That tendency, right? The older sister, the big sister tendency to want to solve your younger sibling's problem, right? That I think that resonates with so many older sisters, oldest daughter dynamic. I would like to hear a little more about like, how do we just kind of fall into that as a big sister? And then how can we unlearn? Like you shared a little bit about your journey, but is there any other tips that you can provide other oldest daughters and big sisters who like to solve their siblings' problems?
So we fall into it. I can't even tell you when I fell into it. Like, I feel like for as long as I have been alive, I have known this. Because I was 4 when my sister was born, and like that's all I know. I don't know how to identify when it happened, but I don't even think that's important. I think what is important is how do we identify it now? And the biggest sign is resentment. You know, if you are starting to feel resentful about your sibling constantly coming to you, or you see the phone ring and you're like, "Ugh, what do they want?" Or if you're just kind of feeling like, why is my sister such a mess? Or why is my brother so like messy? If you start feeling these kind of resentful feelings, that is a really good red flag. That doesn't make you a bad sibling. What happens is we have these feelings and we're like, oh my God, how can I ever think this about my sibling? We become very shaming to ourselves. But I think what we should do instead is take a step back and really think about, oh, wait, why am I feeling this? Why am I feeling this? Like, where is this feeling coming from? And really track that, because resentment is the biggest sign of a boundary transgression. And when we jump to fix other people's problems, we are actually disrespecting our own boundary. And your body is like, no, I'm not comfortable. I'm angry. I'm resentful, right? It's trying to tell you something, and so you have to listen. So that's the first thing. If you're feeling resentful, that's something to get curious about. Another is if you and your sibling are often locked in the blame battle. If they are blaming you a lot for things going wrong in their life, you have certainly overstepped. And I will say, as older siblings, we do set the tone for the relationship, because we are the ones who take the first step. Because we're older, just by virtue of being alive for longer. Right. And so sometimes we enable these behaviors that we are upset about. There are exceptional circumstances where there is some family dynamic or family trauma that can really shift that. But for the most part, we set the tone of the relationship. And if somebody has a different opinion, I would love to hear it. I'm not saying I'm the gospel truth on this. This is just my understanding of it. So if your siblings are blaming you for shit, then you've overstepped. Then you've definitely crossed a line. So that's a point for you to take a step back. And the third is thinking about how uncomfortable you feel if your sibling is like making a mistake or, you know, going through like a hard time. Like, are you so enmeshed that you are feeling their pain, or can you comfortably have a distance and be like, that must be really hard for my sister, right? So like, you know, sometimes when you're younger, we used to have these friends, like she was in my grade and her sister was in my sister's grade. And if the younger sister would cry, this is when we were young, this is like, I was in grade 5 or something. If the younger sister cried, like my friend would immediately start crying. Like it was like, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Things in the playground, the spinny like machines of death. Like I hate them. Her sister fell off that and she started crying. Like I remember this. And my sister was on there too. And like, you know, we're exactly the same age, the two sister groups. And I look over and she was bawling because her sister was crying. That dynamic can go into adulthood and you have complete emotional enmeshment. And if you have that, and if you are feeling like your mood is affected because your sibling is not doing well, that's also a sign that you are too invested. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about them, but your emotional reactions need to be separate from another person.
Yeah.
You can have empathy, of course, right? But you can't have codependency.
I think you were talking about like some key characteristics of eldest daughters here. Like we also frame a lot of like codependency as empathy too. Yeah. And so could you tell us a little bit about then what differentiates like the codependency and empathy?
And also for me, as listening to you reflecting on my journey with my sibling, for me, a lot of things I told myself this was my responsibility as an older sister, which my parents also told me that you gotta set the tone, you gotta be a model, you have to take care of your younger sibling, right? So you have to help them out, help them solve problems. Like I heard it so many times growing up. So how do we differentiate that? You know, like also like I had to learn that it's not my responsibility as I got older, but yeah.
Yeah. I think like as we talk about these two questions, I'm just going to speak about adult siblings. Because I think when we're younger, like, it's like we can't figure it out. They can't,
Right.
nobody can figure anything out. Right?
Yeah.
There's just mass confusion everywhere. So as adults, and your younger sibling is also an adult at this point in your journey, right? So the first question is, the difference between codependency and empathy is control. When we are codependent, by the way, I'm actually writing a full newsletter on this. It's literally called Empathy versus Codependency, because I think it's such an important topic, is control. When we are codependent, we are either being controlled by another person or we want to exercise control over them, right? Empathy is saying, damn, I feel what you're feeling, but I respect your decision. And whatever decision you make, when it sucks, I'm going to be there to support you. I'll be there to help you through it. And if you succeed, I'm going to be there to celebrate. So empathy is not trying to exercise control over the outcome. Codependency is. I would say that that's the biggest difference. And it's so subtle, right? Like when you're trying to prevent, like you just know that the thing your sibling is doing is going to end up in a disaster. Like, you know it, you see the red flags in their potential partner, and you're like, damn, this is going to suck. I think we have to give our younger siblings the respect of being human beings who deserve a full life experience, who deserve to experience the highs and the lows of being a human person, because it improves their resilience. It improves their emotional regulation. It makes them more multifaceted and dynamic, right? And it also gives them skills. If you're still, writing your younger siblings' work emails, you are preventing them from learning that, right? If you are still trying to solve their work problems, you are preventing them from learning that. So to answer your question, Linda, that's how you differentiate it. You ask yourself, is my behavior going to help my younger sibling actually improve? Or am I limiting some experience, even if it's a bad one? Right. Because immigrant parents want to shield us from all bad experiences because their experiences have been very negative. But so much of that results in us not knowing a lot of stuff. So many immigrant kids don't know how to swim because parents were too afraid that they might drown. Literally, right? Like, oh, no, like, it's too scary. So we are very risk averse as a community. And so we don't even want to take emotional risks. But if you don't take emotional risks, like, you will never learn that you are able to withstand it. And so I think with your younger siblings, you have to remind yourself, and this is something I do, is I have to remind myself constantly that, you know what, like, she needs to learn this. She needs to learn how to handle heartbreak. She needs to learn how to write this email. She needs to learn how to get this feedback from her boss. Like, I'm not going to tell her how to have this conversation. And so I have to constantly do this to myself. My sister jokes that she's my only child because I don't have kids and I'm not going to have kids. So she often says to me, she's like, I'm like your only child. Because it's true. Like, I definitely behave that way. Even now, like, she's like 32 years old and I'm still like all up in her grill all the time. And I have to catch myself.
Right. The empty nesting.
Yes, exactly. I'm an empty nester at 37.
Yeah.
And you know what's interesting? I will say one last piece because I know we're coming up against time. I made a TikTok video, and this is actually one of my most popular TikTok videos, on the pipeline of eldest daughters to child-free by choice women. Like, that pipeline is so strong, and if you go and read the comments, there's literally over 1,000 comments in there. All of the eldest daughters are like, I already had 4 kids. I raised my mom's kids. And so the pipeline is definitely strong there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm definitely reflecting back on how I did play a role being a mom and parent to my younger sister. I was literally told that I had to be a little mom when my parents were there too.
And that's the thing. So everything I'm saying, I don't intend to shame anybody who's listening to it. We were given no other option.
Right.
There was no other option on the table. I have very distinct memories of when there was no other option on the table. I think what is required is, the way our parents raised us is our inheritance, but it is not our future. And so we must do the work of decoupling all of the stuff that our parents have given us that is not helpful for us. The stuff that is helpful, we have to keep. And so that requires you to become more inward looking. It requires you to confront yourself in like a gentle way, but you have to confront yourself and say, you know what, this is not helping me anymore. This is not like some of the dated advice about love and romance I got from my parents. Like, it just doesn't work, And so I had to let it go. And I've been in therapy for 5 years. So I think therapy is a very excellent tool for this.
We agree.
Yes.
We want to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
What are some key strategies you suggest for oldest daughters and also for other folks who are trying to break free from hustle culture and embrace more balanced, intentional way of living?
So I think that sometimes it's very hard to stop doing things because we're so accustomed to doing them. So sometimes it's easier to start doing something else, right? So what I'm really encouraging a lot of my community to do, and I think this is something that eldest daughters don't allow themselves at all, is to do something just for themselves. And I don't mean like an expensive facial or anything like that. I genuinely mean like carving out a part of this universe that is just your own. Whether that's through a creative hobby, whether that's through doodling, whether that's through volunteering your time, right? But it's something that you do for the sake of the joy for yourself, not for anybody else. And that will transform the way you engage with joy. Because many of us, myself included, are very unfamiliar with joy when there's some other person not involved. A lot of our joy comes from being in service to others, right? A lot of our meaning comes from that. You don't want to get rid of that. I don't want anybody to be like, damn, I'm just going to abandon my siblings. Like, that's not what we're doing here. But it's like, how can you expand it to include yourself? And so I really want people to pick up a hobby in this next year that you cannot monetize. You cannot make a side hustle Instagram account about it. You cannot post it anywhere, right? You just have to do it in the present moment for the sake of it. And whether that's joining a class, learning a new skill, whatever it is. I think that is a really good way to reacquaint yourself with joy. And that opens up your horizon to be like, wait, like, why do I have to do all this other shit? The other more tactical thing I think we can do is this thing called undercommitting. So if you know that you're available 4 nights a week, because let's just say your schedule is free, you got to start telling people that you're available 3 nights a week. If you're available 3 nights a week, you got to start telling people that you're available 2 nights a week. You have to undercommit instead of overcommitting.
Right.
And I think that's really helpful in tapping out of the hustle culture.
Would you tell the audience how to find more about you and your new book, Toxic Productivity?
You have it. Thank you. Yes. So my book, Toxic Productivity, is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, everywhere books are sold. It has an audiobook version too. I think some people really like audiobooks, so that's available. And if you have a Prime membership, I think it just comes with the Audible. More about me is on my website, IsraaNassir.com, and I have a lot of resources I'll be sharing over the next year about this topic. I'm very active on Instagram, so you can always reach me there.
Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening for Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. If you have found any value from the show, please follow us at Yellow Chair Collective on Instagram and go on our website, yellowchaircollective.com, if you would like our services.